So we will begin as we always do with a review of where we've been. And so we've been through Esther chapter 1 and 2. And in chapter 1, we discovered that this was an introduction to King Ahasuerus, and he is king over the Persian Empire around about 484 to 481 BCE. He is ruling out of the capital city of Susa. We discovered that at that time the empire was preparing to go to war with the Greeks. And in the second part, it was revealed that Queen Vashti had refused to come at the king's command to display her royal crown and her beauty, and how an edict was then issued that the 7 advisors had given to the king because of the disgrace that had brought upon the king and the kingdom. So that's the summary of chapter 1. That gives us our foundation for everything else that unfolds in the book. Then we moved to chapter 2 last week, and in there we were introduced to Esther and to Mordecai as the search for a queen was carried out, and Esther was crowned queen, and Mordecai saved the life of the king. So that's the summary for chapter 2. The reason I do the summary is twofold. One is for those who haven't been here to have some idea where the flow of the communication has been from the scriptures before we get into the new chapter that we're going to talk about today. The second reason is for you to be thinking about how do you break down a book and come up with a memory of the chapters. So instead of me saying, you should memorize the entire book of Esther, it's so much easier to say, do you remember what chapter 1 was about in high form? In other words, a sentence or two for you to remember what chapter 1 was about, and the same thing for chapter 2. For me, that's been helpful in the past. If I'm having a discussion with somebody and something comes up that I remember was somewhere in Esther, I at least have an idea of, I think that was back in chapter 2. So I can open to Esther chapter 2 and narrow down the time it's going to take me to maybe have a response in communication with somebody. So an overview of books is a really good way to do that so that when you're talking with somebody, you can easily or more easily go there. So that's why I do it twofold. So that brings us then to chapter 3, and that's what we're going to cover today is Esther chapter 3. We're going to begin with the first 6 verses of chapter 3. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But his disdain to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Okay, so we begin there in verse 1. It has a phrase that says, after these things. So the events that were just revealed to us was chapter 2, and that dealt with Esther becoming the queen and a revelation by Mordecai of a plot to kill the king. So it's after these things occur. The narration of Esther is focused on happenings in the Persian courts that ultimately have an impact on God's people. So the next thing recorded is a significant elevation in that court, as detailed that King Ahasuerus had promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. In other words, there could be other things going on throughout the kingdom, as we discussed about wars and revolutions and all of that, but Esther stays primarily focused on events in this court as they relate to God's people. So after the things of Queen Esther being crowned and Mordecai saving the life of the king, the next event we're given is the elevation of Haman, because it's going to have an impact on God's people. So the declaration that Haman was an Agagite may refer to a particular ethnic group, but there is nothing known with certainty about the people this name designates. The Bible Knowledge Commentary tells us that archaeologists have uncovered an inscription which indicates that Agag was also the name of a province in the Persian Empire. This probability explains why Haman was called an Agagite. However, the Jews have a particular desire for a moral lesson to be revealed here. They want to find a reason why Mordecai would not obey the king. So there are some who have put forth the premise that this man was a descendant from King Agag, and that story is found in 1 Samuel chapter 15. There are some parallels. I'll give it some time, this time as we go through Esther. There are some parallels in that narrative that would be clear in 1 Samuel, that the Amalekites were sworn enemies of the Jews. Now remember, that means we're making an assumption that Agag is an Amalekite, and that is not clearly established in Esther. There is a conflict established in 1 Samuel between King Agag and King Saul, who was a Benjamite. God had also commanded the extermination of the Amalekites. So I'm just going to read a few verses from 1 Samuel chapter 15. We'll do verses 17 through 19. So 1 Samuel chapter 15, beginning in verse 17. Samuel said, "It is not true, though you were little in your own eyes, you were made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed you king over Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are exterminated. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord?" So you can see that there could be some parallels, as was drawn to what we find in Esther. You've got a Benjamite leader, that would be Mordecai, against Haman, that might represent a leader from the Amalekites. I just don't want to go too far down that rabbit trail, but to at least address it. For our purposes, we're going to stay focused on the narrative in Esther. We simply do not know the true connection of Haman to the Amalekites. In Esther 3, verse 1, it clearly states that King Ahasuerus promoted Haman and specifically defines the authority he was to have over the princes who were with him. The Bible does not establish what happened to bring about this promotion of Haman. The authority he was given was over the princes that were with him. This would demonstrate some limited authority. However, we are not told how far that authority reached in the kingdom at this point in the narrative. The Bible does establish what happened. Considering the power that King Ahasuerus later gives Haman, we can conclude he did fill a very prominent position in the administration and structure of this government. That we can safely conclude. In verse 2, we find details that it was all the king's servants who were at the king's gate that were to respond to Haman in a particular fashion. This was a place, remember, the king's gate is a place where decisions would be made and a place of honor for all those who served there. All these men serving in a position of influence in the king's gate were to specifically bow and pay homage to Haman. We don't use the word homage much in our general speech, so we just need to understand it is a word that depicts showing special honor or respect to someone in a public way. The bowing down and giving honor to Haman publicly was because the king had commanded it. Next, we hear that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. In verse 3, the result of Mordecai's public response is that the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Wouldn't that be the logical question? The king's servants at the gate would have been men serving alongside Mordecai at the king's gate. They would have been men of prominence, just like Mordecai was. Once the king has spoken, everyone should have been expected to do what the king commands, or experience the consequences when they disobey the king. As we have seen, disobeying a command of the king can have very negative consequences, as in the case of Queen Vashti. These men are looking for the reason that Mordecai would not obey the king. It would appear until this time, Mordecai has been completely loyal and obedient to this king. Verse 4 reveals the men spoke daily to Mordecai, but he would not listen to them. This does not mean that he did not hear them, but that he would not obey the command of bowing down and giving homage. We are not told how many days this takes place. So we don't know how many days the men within the gate came to Mordecai and said, "Hey, why are you not obeying?" But we don't know. When Mordecai does not obey the command of the king, these men decide to tell Haman. The scriptures say the reason the men told Haman was this: to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew. So when Mordecai is questioned about why he is not bowing down and giving homage to Haman, his reason was because he was a Jew. There is nothing given in detail about why a Jew would not be allowed to give homage to Haman. It is just stated as a matter of fact. Mordecai would have recognized men who had authority over him. That's why he's in the king's gate. He's already accepted that there are men that have authority over him. He has obviously done this in service to the king. Bowing to show respect to those with authority would not have been a violation of Jewish law. Mordecai was already doing that in regards to his relationship with the king. We don't do a lot of bowing. We do more handshakes or maybe a hug in our culture. But bowing in this culture was definitely practiced as a show of respect. How far you bowed, if you bowed first or second, all of those kind of things can be taken into consideration. And if you work in the government and you do any kind of work like an ambassador and you go to a different culture, you learn all of those details. So it does not appear that the actual bowing down would have been a problem. Paying homage, we don't know because it's not totally clarified for us. This may, however, be the first time that Mordecai has shared publicly that he is a Jew. He had given counsel to Esther not to share this about herself, and it may be that it was Mordecai's practice as well. A protective revelation now has been given. So in other words, he's now revealed something about himself in this court. Now, does the scripture say he didn't share this before? No. So I don't know if he had, but now we know he clearly has. Again, staying with the context and what the scriptures actually reveal to us. The question was whether the reason of being a Jew would be a rationale accepted by Haman or the court to allow Mordecai to disobey the command given by King Ahasuerus. You see, there's a lot going on here. In verse 5, it's revealed when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, he was filled with rage. It appears the lack of bowing down was not evident to Haman until it is brought to his attention by the servants who were in the king's gate. Put yourself in the position again. We got the king's gate. You got a lot of activity, noise, whatever. Haman walks through. You got a bunch of men. They're bowing down, paying homage, doing whatever they're supposed to do. There are those that then obviously don't do it, but it's not drawn to Haman's attention. Mordecai did not go out of his way to demonstrate that he was not bowing down. He was not making it a declaration to draw attention to himself. in that, I would say there's deference and respect because he is not trying to make a spectacle of himself. He is not trying to draw attention to himself. It does not seem that Mordecai went out of his way to be obvious about not bowing down or giving homage. Once Haman was aware of the lack of obedience, now he goes looking for evidence of it. When Haman verifies that Mordecai is not bowing down or paying homage to him, he is filled with rage. Now, the result of this rage is seen in verse 6, as two things are exposed. First, Haman has discovered that Mordecai is a Jew, and secondly, that Haman's desire is now not only to destroy Mordecai, but all the Jews in the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus. That's some rage. I think we don't give enough emphasis to what that word actually means and how it takes over a being and causes them to process or to take out that anger in very unhealthy ways. So I was sometimes upset by people cutting me off in traffic, but I can't say that I was filled with rage. Sometimes it's close, no. So we do not know if Haman's reason to destroy the people of Mordecai was to make an example of him, or if there was some long-standing hatred towards the Jews. We do not know which it is. It could be both. It could be one. The fact that Haman has a desire to destroy all the Jews might be linked to his description of being an Agagite. We simply do not know. So that brings us now to the next verses of Esther. So chapter 3, beginning in verse 7, and I'll read through verse 11. In the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month, until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it's pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they will be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business, to put into the king's treasuries. Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people also. Do with them as you please. Again, we get to see some inner workings of a royal court. In verse 7, it gives us a lot of details in regards to the time reference, beginning with the detail of the next events happening in the first month, which is the month Nisan. Remember, the dates that we are given are from a Jewish calendar perspective. Next, the time period these events occur in this next frame, we know that is the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, which we know to be 5 years since Esther was made queen. Remember back in chapter 2, verse 16, so Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So the event described as beginning to take place here is that a that is a lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. First of all, let's highlight the fact that is a Babylonian word for lot. We're given that right there in the scriptures. But what is a lot? A lot would be like for us casting dice. There they would have been clay cubes, which they have found, so we know what they look like. They're about an inch in diameter, a lot bigger than our dice. The lot was cast, it says here, before Haman, and day to day until the 12th month. the Jewish month of Adar. That's a lot of time for these to be cast. Haman had the lot cast until whatever form of confirmation led to the day of the month that he is to take his plan against the Jews. Haman was waiting for the lot to be cast that would indicate that he would have a successful plan. We don't cast a lot of lots again in our culture. We don't think that's how our governmental decisions are made, but who knows? In the Persian religious system, it was known to be very superstitious, and it stressed fate and chance. Haman was following the concept of fate by casting the lots to dictate when he would take moves against the Jews. Haman cast the lots to receive the diviner's direction before bringing it to the king. In other words, he wants to get all his ducks in a row before he takes his plan forward to the king. His inquiry began with which day would be best, and then moved to the month. That's why you see it worded day to day and month to month. The month that was determined was the 12th month. On the Jewish calendar, this is known as Adar. So now we move to verse 8. In verse 8, when Haman has a confirmation that the time is right to bring the request before King Ahasuerus, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people, scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain." A pretty politically savvy man. So we'll begin. Haman begins with his request before the king in identifying that there is a subset of people that are scattered and dispersed in all the provinces of his kingdom. Here, they're referred to as certain people. Notice he does not say who the people are. Haman uses flattery from the beginning with the king, if it pleases the king. Also notice referring to it as your kingdom. So there are a lot of words as you read it through. You can see what Haman is up to. Haman secondly emphasizes the threat to Ahasuerus' kingdom and that it is located in all the provinces for the king. So as we know, that would be the 127 provinces of the Persian kingdom. What we would be able to discern from that is that there must be some form of a Jewish settlement in all the provinces. So the Jews had not remained just in one of the provinces. They had scattered among all the provinces. So they were scattered throughout the Persian kingdom. The final point to be made is why these people pose a threat to the kingdom, that they hold to laws that are different from those of other people, not just the king himself, but other people. The Jews have maintained being a distinctive race of people by practicing many of the things passed down to them from their law. For example, they are to marry within the Jewish community. That's still practiced largely today, especially in Orthodox Jewish communities. The strength of the community is maintained by practicing special observances, like keeping of the Sabbath or celebrating their annual feasts together. This is combined with daily habits that separate them from their surrounding people, like sticking to strict dietary laws and just other activities in their life that was spelled out for them in the law. This is not unique to this time period in history. This has been a practice of Jews since they've become a nation. Historically, Jews have not been assimilated or absorbed into other cultures. And that is a very unique characteristic, that a people group has maintained their distinctiveness throughout history. The final accusation that Haman makes about these people is that they do not observe the king's laws. There is an insinuation that all other people groups did not have a difficult time adhering to the king's laws. Only this particular group had a problem with that. We know that not to be true just based on the general history that we already talked about. There were revolutions within these other provinces, like in Egypt and in Babylon. Not everybody agreed with all the laws of the king. They were forced to comply, but that doesn't mean that they were all in agreement. Again, the man has a silver tongue, as they say. Haman does not give the specific laws of the king that these people did not observe. The ones that had been defined in the book of Esther is that Mordecai had disobeyed the king's command to bow down and pay homage. That's the only one that is identified for so far in this narrative. Haman does not identify who these people are, or at least that's not given to us here. So the revelation we have here is the wording was a certain people. So it's like he's gone out of his way not to say who the people are. And interestingly, the king doesn't ask who the people are. Don't you think if somebody's coming to you, you're the king, and they're saying, man, there's this group of people and they are scattered in every province and they don't agree with your laws, what would be one of your questions as the king? Who are these people? King doesn't even ask. Sure, Haman, I just believe whatever you say. He doesn't. What laws are they not abiding by? Who are these people? No questions from this king. No questions. With all the evidence that Haman says he has discerned about these people, he concludes, so it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. Remember, Haman is a trusted advisor to the king, and he presents his proposal as something that would be good for the king and his kingdom. We are not told Haman reveals what laws. We talked about that. We also don't know how many people are represented in this proposal. Wouldn't that be another question? Not only what people and what other laws, how many people are we talking about here? None of what you would think to be logical questions seem to be posed. The obvious insinuation is that the people keeping separate and keeping their own laws, and in doing so, not keeping the laws of the kingdom, make them a significant threat. So much so that they must be removed. Now, Haman moves to the solution for this threat in verse 9, as he says, if it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business, to put into the king's treasuries. Here we go. Again, intrigue of the court and actually how governments often operate. Haman endears himself to the king by beginning with, if it pleases the king. He's always the consummate politician. The solution for this threat is to have a decree that they will be destroyed. Remember, a decree made in the Persian system of government could not be rescinded. Haman knows this. All large-scale government actions involve a cost. I won't get political here, but apparently that gets forgotten by a lot of governments. Haman takes the responsibility for the cost of this project when he tells the king he is willing to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business, to put it in the king's treasuries. So 10,000 talents of silver weighs about 750,000 pounds. A pound of silver today, or at least yesterday, would come to about $366 a pound. The value of silver varies, but this would represent an enormous amount of money, worth in today's value in the millions of dollars. This was a staggering sum of money, even back then, which Haman was willing to pay. What we know then is Haman is a very wealthy man. It does appear wealthy men have a tendency to rise and political governmental systems. Haman promises to put the funds into the king's treasuries. From there, the funds are to be given into the hands of those who carry out the king's business. Don't you just love this? So Haman says he's willing to foot the cost of this project. This means so much to Haman that he's willing to personally pay to see the project is carried out. Haman is ingratiating himself to the king, and this could be seen as bribing the king. Many men of power will look the other way or not ask about details when a significant amount of money is being given to them. Greed is a powerful tool in controlling the direction of political decisions, here and throughout history. Just a little note from Proverbs on the topic of greed. So in Proverbs chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. Proverbs 11, verses 5 and 6. The righteousness of the blameless will smooth his way, but the wicked will fall by his own wickedness. The righteous of the upright will deliver them, but the treacherous will be caught by their own greed. Greed is a form of idolatry. We see this in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. So Colossians 3, verse 5. Therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. So it's not a small thing that we see going on here in the court, as there's a lot of greed evident in what is happening. King Ahasuerus is lured into Haman's trap by his greed. In verse 10, the king takes a significant action and he removes his signet ring and he hands it to Haman. A signet ring held the official seal of the king by which authorized business would take place in the kingdom. The king basically handed over the decisions of the kingdom to Haman at this point, not just in regards to this issue with the Jews. He's taken off his ring and he's handed it to Haman. The king has been bought by Haman. Haman is again described here as the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, titled as the enemy of the Jews. So you can see why there may be some reference to that name and how it ties back to a longer battle between the Jews and potentially Haman's people. Verse 11 demonstrates the outcome of Haman's generous offer, as the king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please. So we have evil upon evil here. Notice the silver already belonged to Haman. So when the king makes this declaration, he's telling Haman that he does not need to put the funds in the treasury. He can just enforce the decree and spend the funds needed to carry out the decree. The second part of what the king declares is more revealing, as he literally says these people belong to Haman now, and he can do as he pleases with them. Haman has effectively purchased all the Jews in King Ahasuerus' kingdom. They belong to him. He paid it, and the king acknowledged what he paid for, and he said, they're yours. You feel the tension building in our story? Let's finish, well, not finish, but let's do the verses, 12 through 15 of Esther chapter 3, beginning in verse 12. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written just as Haman commanded to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princes of each people. Each province according to its script, each people according to its language, being written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews. both young and old, women and children, in one day, 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the peoples so that they should be ready for this day. The couriers went out impelled by the king's command while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. So Haman wastes no time as he summons the king's scribes on the 13th day of the first month. Haman has approached King Ahasuerus in the 12th month of Adar, as we saw back in verse 7. This was a significant day in many ways. The significance of the day to the Jews must not be overlooked. The Jews will be celebrating the next day Passover. Leviticus 23:5 and Numbers 9:5. So I'll read Leviticus 23:5. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight is the Lord's Passover. In Numbers 9:5. They observed the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So the sons of Israel did. You see how important the details are in the scriptures. This event occurs on the 13th day, and the very next day, these Jews, who a decree is being issued about, are going to celebrate their Passover. This day was a remembrance for the Jews of their deliverance from Egypt. We get that in Exodus chapter 12, and I'll do verses 23 through 27. So if you look with me in Exodus chapter 12, beginning with verse 23. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. When you enter the land which the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And this people bowed low and worshipped. So this is the date that Passover is to be observed, and this is why they were to observe the Passover. The Jews were just celebrating a remembrance of a time when God had spared them from destruction and also destroyed their enemies as Haman continues to carry out his plan. So now you see this storyline going on underneath. So we have the obvious one, which is what Haman's doing, right? And all the things that he's going to declare about the Jews. But by picking the date that he does, again, by the fates, by the casting of the lot, just happens to be a day that he makes the announcements that's right before the Jews celebrating their deliverance from others who had tried to enslave them and who were their enemies. In Esther 3:12, the details about what Haman commanded, it is now commanded by King Ahasuerus. It's not commanded by Ahasuerus, but by Haman himself. So Haman wastes no time in carrying out his desires. He gets the pretty ring, and he starts working right away on what's most important to him. The command goes out to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princes of each people. Each province according to his script, each people according to its language. This is the same language that we found when the decree was issued in removing Queen Vashti in Esther 1:22. So it would just seem this is the norm when a decree is issued. This is how it gets communicated to all the provinces. The scriptures clarify that it is all written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. The king is not innocent. The king is complicit in these actions as he was the one specifically making the decision to allow Haman this kind of authority and power. The king also knew Haman's intentions were to wipe out a people group. The king is not innocent here. The specifics of what is being communicated is detailed next in verse 13. So the letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. All right. The time period given for the events to begin is exactly 11 months from the issuing of this decree. So the decree is issued on the 13th day of the first month and to be carried out the 13th day of the 12th month. That flow with what everybody sees at the script. There's quite a few months between when the decree is issued and when it's to be carried out. The expanse of the destruction is simply understood to kill and annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, etc. They clarify it very clearly. All are to be wiped out. The term used in our modern world is known as genocide. This is a deliberate and complete elimination of a people group or an ethnic group. Ultimately, the aim is to remove that group of people from existence. Who do you think would be behind such a sinister plan, today as well as back then? The enemy. The enemy is always at work. The supplemental action of seizing their possessions as plunder gives the added incentive that would be given to those participating in carrying out the commands of this decree. Don't miss that point. Again, financial advantage in carrying out something very horrific. Haman has already been put in charge of the finances to carry out this decree. Remember, they were funds that already belonged to him. Now they've been set aside for this particular purpose. This would probably have been a military action to carry out such destruction within the kingdom. You wouldn't just allow all the citizenry to up and do whatever. They're being notified that it's going to happen, but this most likely would be a military action that's going to take place. Kind of like we talked about when all of them were gathered for the 6 months prior to everybody going after the Greeks. We want consensus and agreement, but we also want to figure out logistics. How is it going to be carried out? Who's going to do it? How are we going to pay? All of those details need to be worked out, and Haman's giving himself plenty of time to work out the details. Verse 14, it indicates that a copy of the edict was issued as law and was to be carried to all of the provinces or every province, and it was to be carried out with the full weight of being law in the land of all the provinces. The edict was sent out quickly and put in writing so that all the peoples, so that they should be ready for the day. Wow. All the citizenry was put on notice that this was acknowledged to be the law of the land. They would allow those carrying out the law to be free to carry out the law. In other words, if you're a neighbor and you see something bad's going to happen, the law says you have to let it happen. So it's also to discourage any that might want to come and be supportive of protecting the Jews. This is the law of the land. This would also alert other people and other people groups that this was going on. So everybody's got information in their hand ahead of time about what's happening. When the killing would begin, It would be limited to a subset within the citizenry, and those not included in the edict would know they were safe. This would avoid expansive fear from taking over from the general population. You see how that would work, right? If in your city suddenly the military or whatever police unit starts to come and takes your neighbor, kills your neighbor, and you don't know why the neighbor got killed, you're going to think you could be next. So the law was to define, no, we don't want the rest of you to be, upset or fearful or anxious. We want you to know you're okay. It's just these people. This group, they're the only ones in danger. You're okay. Verse 15, it details how the decree was to be sent by courier to all the provinces. There seems to be some urgency in the message, even though there is time to prepare for the event. Next, the decree was specifically issued at the citadel in Susa. While the decree was being delivered to all the cities, right, to all the provinces in a written form, couriers were taking it out to post it. It was finally posted, or probably quickly posted, in the city of Susa. And in the city of Susa, we find the king and Haman sat down to drink. These men were probably celebrating the decree that was just issued in the city of Susa. That's not in the scriptures. I'm just saying it's very interesting that that point would be made, that while this devastation or the devastating impact of the decree is going out, they're having a drink with one another. King Ahasuerus did not wash his hands of this event or this decision. The result of the decree left the city of Susa in confusion. People would have been confused because there was no reason for this kind of destruction of this people group. The Jews had not done anything within the empire to justify this action. There was no threat being made by the Jews to the Persian kingdom. There was no declaration of war of the Jews towards the Persian kingdom. The decree made no sense to the people, and this is what left them in confusion. When there is no reason given for this grievous act, the people are left with more questions than answers. The question of who could the rulers turn on next would bring distrust to many. When those in authority do not act in rational ways, it leaves those under that authority doubting the motives of those in power. This undermines the strength of the kingdom. Haman just happens to come along in the right time of history and rise to prominence. King Ahasuerus just happens to be willing to sell out a people group in his kingdom. The king just happens to allow a decree to be issued in the kingdom where the decree could not be rescinded. Remember, that was specific to the Persian Empire. Mordecai just happens to have stayed diligent and useful to the king and is still serving in the king's gate. The Jews did not go out looking for trouble, yet God allows this trouble to arise for the Jews at his perfect time in history. We again are confronted with God's perfect timing in every event contained in human history. There are no coincidences in our lives. Everything happens for a reason, even when we are not given the insight from God as to why the events occur. For those of you who just finished Job, there's a whole book about that. Confirmation of that for us can be found in the New Testament as well, in Acts chapter 17. I'll do verses 24 through 28. So Acts 17, beginning verse 24. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. So we need to remember in our daily lives, there are boundaries and times that were already determined by God according to this Acts verse or verses. We need to meditate on the fact that it is in him that we now live and move and exist. In the midst of the circumstances of our lives, do we stay focused on God's will when we don't understand? The confusion that the city of Susa was left in talks about the general population. What do you think the confusion in the Jewish communities in 127 provinces of the kingdom was like? Absolute confusion. Why, God? Why have you allowed? And that's so often our questions. We think about the why have you allowed when we think about the bad. But do we think about the why have you graced me with my breath and my existence and my movements today? You see where our focus needs to be when we have an eternal perspective? Not why for the bad, why for the good? Why am I still here? Why am I given the opportunity to know you? Why is your word being revealed? Why do you give me all that? Why do I wake up in the morning? That's where our why should be. Not the whys that in our human nature we have a tendency to dwell on, to become anxious about. The whys usually have things we have no control over changing. Just focus on your why of existence, and that is every day, what is God's will for me? It really is simple. I'm not saying it's easy, but it really is simplified when you study his word. These people lived in an entirely different time frame, different government, but their lives were no different than ours are. They woke up with their questions of whys. They had governments they didn't feel they could trust or that would hear them, right? I'm not getting into anything political because I'm not going to go there. I'm just saying history repeats itself. And just as Esther still was the queen and Mordecai was still serving in the king's gate, that was their daily event. We don't get to hear about the past 5 years of what happened to Esther. Sorry, or to Mordecai. We don't get to hear any of that. But apparently they were faithful. They got up every day and they did what they were supposed to do in the roles that they'd been given. The book just kind of highlights the big points. Just like our life. If you did a little story of yourself, you don't write every day, you give the highlights. And the highlight from the book of Esther, remember, is always about what God is allowing for his purposes, for his people. Remember, a book that doesn't even mention God.